The Grand Convocation Hall on Thessera Prime was the largest structure ever built by any known civilization, and on this day, every seat was filled with delegates from 489 species, who had gathered to decide the fate of a dying world. Ambassador Ilara Voss stood at the central podium, her back straight and her voice calm as she addressed the massive chamber that stretched out before her like a cathedral made of light and stone, and she could feel the weight of every alien eye upon her small human frame. "The Dravani are dying," she said, and her voice carried across the vast hall without trembling. "The Orthani Combine has been stripping their world bare for 6 standard cycles now, and they have no means to fight back because they have not yet developed faster-than-light travel, and they do not even know that the galaxy beyond their sky is full of species who could save them if they chose to." She paused and looked across the rows of delegates. The insectoid Kreth with their gleaming carapaces, the towering crystalline Gellar who pulsed within her light, the elegant Valori with their silver skin and cold, proud eyes, and hundreds more, each one representing a civilization that had existed for thousands of years before humanity ever left its homeworld. "I am asking this council to authorize a humanitarian intervention," Ilara continued. "I am asking us to do what we were created to do, which is to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The silence that followed was not the silence of contemplation, but the silence of indifference, and Ilara could feel it pressing against her like a wall. High Commercer Zelith of the Orthani Combine rose from his seat, his massive gray form unfolding like a mountain, deciding to stand. And when he spoke, his voice rumbled through the chamber with the confidence of someone who had never once been told no. "The Dravani world is a resource zone legally claimed under Galactic Commerce Statute 774, he said, and his 4 eyes blinked slowly as he looked down at the human ambassador, the way one might look at an insect on a dinner plate. "The humans ask us to intervene in lawful commerce because they feel sad about creatures who have not even achieved basic spaceflight, and I must remind this council that sentiment is not policy." Laughter rippled through the chamber, not from every delegate, but from enough of them to make the sound echo and grow, and fill the hall like poison filling a glass. Zelith was not finished, and he turned his massive head directly toward Ilara, with something that might have been a smile if his species had been capable of such expressions. "Perhaps the humans should focus on their own fragile little worlds," he said, "rather than lecturing civilizations that were old before their species learned to walk upright. And I say this with all the patience I can muster for what are, at the end of the day, sentimental vermin who mistake weakness for virtue." More laughter, and this time it was louder. Ilara stood very still at the podium and said nothing while the sound washed over her, and her aide, a young man named Thomas Chen, watched from the observation gallery with his hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles had gone white. The vote was called, and one by one the species registered their decisions on the massive holographic display that hung above the chamber like a constellation of choices. And when the final tally appeared, it read 488 against and 1 in favor. Humanity stood alone, as it always had in this place. The council speaker, a Valori named Archon Drenalis, announced the result with barely concealed boredom and said that the motion had failed and that the session would now move on to trade tariff adjustments. And several delegates were already checking their personal devices as if the matter of a dying species had been nothing more than a brief interruption to their real business. Ilara looked at the vote tally for a long moment, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not anger exactly, but something quieter and more dangerous. The look of someone who had just made a decision they could never take back. She closed her datapad with a soft click that somehow cut through the noise of the chamber. Then we have nothing left to discuss, she said. Her voice was not loud, but it carried, and something about the way she said it made a few of the nearest delegates look up from their devices. Ilara stepped down from the podium and walked toward the exit with steady, unhurried steps, and as she walked, she raised her wrist communicator to her lips and spoke a single coded phrase that had been prepared years ago for a moment exactly like this one. Prometheus Unbound, she said. Within minutes the message reached Earth through a chain of quantum-entangled relays that spanned half the galaxy, and within an hour the response came back. A single word that changed everything. Confirmed. The machinery of withdrawal had already been designed and was waiting like a loaded weapon in a locked drawer. And now the drawer was open. Within 6 hours, every human diplomat on every council world received the same orders, and they began to pack with the quiet efficiency of people who had been expecting this call for a long time. Ilara filed the formal document herself from her shuttle as it lifted off from Thesara Prime. Article of Withdrawal 1 Omega. Total and irrevocable exit from the Galactic Council. Effective immediately and without conditions. The Council received the filing and reacted with amusement. Archon Drenelis of the Veilori called an informal session to discuss the matter, and opened it by saying that humanity's departure was regrettable but ultimately insignificant, comparing it to a small fish leaving a vast ocean, and he predicted that the humans would return within a single standard cycle once they realized how much they needed council membership. The Kreth Dominion's representative called it a tantrum and suggested that the council send a sternly worded reminder about the economic consequences of isolation. The Silthari delegate did not even attend the session because she had a dinner engagement she considered more important. High Commercer Zeleth gave a brief interview to the Galactic Press Network, in which he chuckled and said that perhaps the humans would use their time away to grow up a little, and the clip was played on entertainment channels across 3 sectors as a joke. Nobody was worried, and nobody thought to ask the most obvious question, which was why humanity had filed the paperwork so quickly, almost as if the entire withdrawal had been planned and prepared long before the vote had even taken place. In her shuttle, climbing away from the gleaming towers of Thesara Prime, Ilara Voss sat by the viewport and watched the city shrink below her. All those lights, representing all those species who had just told a dying world that its suffering was not their problem. Thomas Chen sat across from her and could see that her expression was not one of defeat, but of something far more unsettling, a calm and absolute certainty. "Ambassador," he said quietly, "are you all right?" Ilara did not look away from the viewport. "They have no idea what they have done," she whispered. Thomas wanted to ask what she meant, but something in her voice told him that the answer would become clear soon enough, and that when it did, the galaxy would never be the same. The shuttle entered hyperspace with a flash of blue-white light, and Thesara Prime disappeared behind them, like a memory that was already fading. Below, in the Grand Convocation Hall, the delegates moved on to the next item on the agenda without a second. Thought, and the empty seat where humanity had sat for 214 years, gathered dust in the silence. No one noticed, and no one cared. They would, soon enough. 3 standard months after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the first cracks began to show, and they appeared in places that nobody had expected. It started with the communications. The quantum relay network was the backbone of galactic civilization, a web of thousands of relay stations that allowed species separated by hundreds of light years to speak to each other in real time. And for over a century, human engineers had been the ones who designed, built, and maintained 74% of those stations. Nobody had paid much attention to this fact because the work was unglamorous, and the humans who did it were quiet and efficient, the kind of workers that powerful civilizations tend to forget about until they stopped showing up. And now they had stopped showing up. The first relay to fail was a minor hub in the Tessari corridor, and when it went dark, it cut communications between two mid-tier trading worlds for 11 days. Valori engineering team could be dispatched to repair it. And when that team arrived, they discovered that the human-designed systems were so far beyond their understanding that they could not even identify what had broken, let alone fix it. Within weeks, more relays began to degrade, and the Galactic Press Network started experiencing delays and blackouts that made real-time broadcasting impossible across large sections of the galaxy. And worlds that had been connected for centuries suddenly found themselves isolated and afraid. Then the medicine ran out. Human pharmaceutical research had been the quiet miracle of the Council era, and over 2 centuries, human scientists had developed cures for 23 previously untreatable diseases that affected non-human species. Diseases that had killed millions every year before humanity arrived and said, "Let us try something." The Valori blood-wasting plague that had haunted their species for 10,000 years had been cured by a human geneticist named Dr. Sarah Okafor, who spent 14 years of her life in a Valori hospital, learning their biology from the ground up. And the treatment she created required a compound that could only be synthesized in human laboratories. Now those laboratories were closed to Council species, and the stockpiles were running low. Hospitals on 100 worlds began rationing, and patients who had been living normal, healthy lives thanks to human medicine started dying again. Slowly at first, and then faster. And the doctors who watched them die knew exactly who to blame, but could not bring themselves to say it out loud. The food crisis came next. Human agricultural scientists had spent decades developing gene-tailored crops that could grow on marginal colony worlds, where the soil was thin and the sunlight was wrong. And these crops fed over 40 billion non-human beings who would have starved without them. The seeds had always been shipped freely because humanity never charged for them, which was something that had baffled and irritated the Orthani Combine for years, since the Orthani believed that anything given for free was either worthless or a trap. Now the seeds stopped coming, and the crops on those marginal worlds began to fail. And within weeks, there were food shortages on dozens of planets. And within months, there were famines, real famines, with real people starving, on worlds that had not known hunger in generations. And then came the translators. The universal translation matrix that allowed hundreds of species to understand each other ran on algorithms that human linguists had written and refined over 2 centuries. And without regular updates and maintenance, the system began to drift, slowly at first, and then with increasing speed. Diplomatic messages were garbled, trade agreements were misunderstood, and on one terrible day, the Kreth Dominion received a transmission from the Silthari Republic that was supposed to be a routine trade proposal, but was translated as a declaration of territorial claim. And both species mobilized their border fleets before a frantic Valori mediator managed to sort out what had happened. The galaxy was coming apart at the seams, not because of war or invasion, but because the species they had mocked and dismissed had been holding everything together, and now those hands were gone. The Council finally swallowed its pride enough to send an envoy to Earth. The delegation was led by a senior Valori diplomat named Fessin, who arrived at the human capital of Geneva with a carefully prepared speech about mutual benefit and the importance of cooperation. And he fully expected to find the humans desperate and eager to negotiate their return. Instead, he was met by Director Kale Marin, the newly appointed head of Earth's exterior affairs. A tall, quiet man with gray at his temples and eyes that looked like they had seen too much and forgiven too little. Marin received the delegation in a simple conference room, with no grand architecture or holographic displays. Just a wooden table and chairs, and a window that looked out over a lake, and he offered them tea, which the Valori could not drink, but appreciated as a gesture. We are here to discuss terms for humanity's return to the Council, Thesson began with practiced dignity. Marin listened politely, and then reached into his jacket and produced a single data pad, which he slid across the table. Before we discuss anything, he said, I would like you to read this. Thesson picked up the data pad and began scrolling through it, and as he read, his silver skin began to pale, in the way that Valori skin does when they experience deep shock. The document was a record of every insult, every betrayal, every exploitation, every ignored plea, every mocking headline, every denied resolution, and every act of contempt that humanity had endured. During its 214 years on the Galactic Council, it was over 9,000 pages long. Every time humanity had proposed environmental protections and been voted down was there. And every time human aid workers had been denied access to disaster zones was there. And every time a human diplomat had been publicly humiliated for suggesting that the powerful had a duty to the weak was there. And all of it was documented with dates and names and exact quotes. Thesson looked up from the datapad with something in his eyes that might have been shame. Director Marin, he said carefully, surely we can find a way forward that serves both our interests. Marin leaned back in his chair and looked at the Valori diplomat for a long, quiet moment. You had partners, he said, and his voice was calm, but carried the weight of 2 centuries of accumulated pain. You chose instead to have subjects, and we are done being your furniture. Returned to Thessara Prime, shaken and empty-handed. And Thesson's private report to the Valori Emperor contained a single recommendation that was immediately classified at the highest level of secrecy. They are not coming back, it read, and we should be very concerned about what they are building instead. Because humanity had not been sitting idle during those 3 months. While the Council scrambled to keep its infrastructure from collapsing, human ships had been appearing in the forgotten corners of the galaxy, the places where no Council species ever bothered to go, the worlds that were too small or too poor or too strange to matter. The Dravani, that same species whose destruction the Council had voted to ignore, received the first human relief ships, and the supplies they carried were not weapons, but food and medicine and teachers and engineers who came with open hands and kind faces and said, we are here to help if you will have us. Swarm, quarantined by the Council for centuries out of irrational fear, received a human linguistic team that spent weeks learning their chemical communication language, and discovered that the Morith were not the mindless hive monsters the Council had described, but poets and philosophers with a rich culture that no one had ever bothered to understand. The Gelar, classified as non-sentient crystalline formations by Council scientists who had spent exactly 1 afternoon studying them, received a human research team that proved within days that the Gelar were not only sentient, but possessed a form of distributed intelligence that was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Humanity was reaching out to the forgotten and the dismissed and the abandoned, and it was doing so with a warmth and sincerity that these species had never experienced from anyone. On Thessara Prime, the Valori ambassador sent a private encrypted message to Director Marin. Back-channel negotiation, away from public scrutiny. A deal made in shadows, where no one would have to admit fault. Marin's response was exactly 2 words: public apology. The Valori cut the transmission in outrage, because no Valori had ever apologized to anyone for anything in the entire recorded history of their civilization. But deep in the night cycle, alone in his private chambers, the Valori ambassador stared at the ceiling and wondered for the first time if perhaps his species had made a terrible mistake, and if the price of their pride might be higher than anyone had imagined. 1 standard year after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the galaxy had become a more dangerous place than it had been in centuries. And the worst part was that nobody could agree on whose fault it was. The Kreth Dominion and the Silthari Republic had been enemies for over 4,000 years, held apart by a web of treaties and agreements and quiet understandings that had been brokered largely by human diplomats who had a strange gift for finding compromise where none seemed possible. Now those diplomats were gone, and the old hatred between the two civilizations had begun to boil again, like a wound that had never truly healed. And border skirmishes that would once have been diffused within hours were now escalating into full fleet mobilizations that brought the galaxy to the edge of a war that could have consumed 100 star systems. The Orthani Combine, sensing the chaos and smelling opportunity the way a predator smells blood, began expanding its territory with aggressive speed, seizing 3 neutral systems in a single month, and declaring them resource zones under the same commerce statutes that had allowed them to strip mine the Dravani homeworld. The Council debated, and the Council voted, and the Council issued a strongly worded statement of concern, and the Orthani ignored it completely, because they knew that without humanity there was no one willing to actually enforce anything. Everything was falling apart, and then came the intelligence reports. And that was when the real fear began. It started with a Valori deep space surveillance probe that stumbled upon a human colony in a system that was not on any galactic map. A system that should have been empty, according to every record the Council possessed. The colony was not small, and it was not primitive. And when the probe's sensors finished their analysis, the data was transmitted back to the Valori Intelligence Service, where it landed on the desk of Director Ilian Kaz, a woman who had spent 60 years analyzing threats to the hegemony, and who had never once, in all those decades, felt genuine terror until she read that report. The colony contained 17 billion human beings. 17 billion on a single world that nobody knew existed, and the infrastructure visible from orbit suggested a technological level that made the probe's own systems look like children's toys. Director Kaz ordered a full intelligence review of everything the Valori knew about humanity, and what came back over the following weeks destroyed every assumption the galaxy had ever made about the youngest species in the Council. The truth was staggering. Humanity had reported its total population to the Council as 8 billion, which was the number living on Earth itself, but this number did not include the colony ships that had been launched in secret over 2 centuries, or the deep space habitats hidden in the dark between stars, or the generation arcs that had been traveling for decades to distant systems, or the dozens of worlds that had been settled and developed without ever being registered in any galactic database. The real number was not 8 billion. It was 94 billion human beings spread across hundreds of hidden systems, a civilization so vast that it dwarfed most Council species and yet had somehow remained invisible for over 2 centuries. And then there was the military. The Galactic Council had evaluated human military technology as roughly comparable to mid-tier Council standards, adequate for self-defense but nothing remarkable. And this evaluation had been based on the weapons and ships that humanity had openly displayed during joint exercises and border patrols. But the intelligence review revealed that what humanity had shown the Council was not its best technology, but rather its oldest and most outdated equipment, boats to a naval review, while keeping the real fleet hidden beneath the waves. Human stealth drives were 3 full generations ahead of anything the Council possessed, capable of rendering entire fleets invisible to every known form of detection. And human weapons research had produced things that the Valori intelligence analysts could barely comprehend. Weaponized singularities that could tear holes in spacetime. Nanoswarm defense systems that could dismantle an attacking fleet at the molecular level. And artificial intelligence so advanced that a single human warship could outthink and outmaneuver an entire Council battle group. Humanity had been playing small on purpose. For 214 years, they had deliberately downplayed their numbers, hidden their colonies, concealed their technology, and presented themselves as a minor species, because they had made a choice. a very human choice, to try to change the galaxy through cooperation and kindness. Then, through the threat of overwhelming force. They had wanted to be accepted as friends, not feared as conquerors, and so they had held back everything they were, and hoped that the galaxy would see their worth without needing to see their strength. The galaxy had not, and now the mask was off. Director Koss delivered her briefing to the Valori Emperor in a sealed chamber deep beneath the Imperial Palace, and when she finished, the room was silent for a very long time. "How confident are you in these numbers?" the Emperor asked quietly. "Very confident, Your Radiance," Koss replied. "And I should tell you that these are conservative estimates, because there are regions of human-controlled space that our probes simply cannot penetrate." The Emperor stared at the holographic display showing the true extent of human civilization, a web of colonies and stations and shipyards that stretched across a quarter of the galaxy, hidden in plain sight, for over two. "They were not the weakest member of the Council," he said. "No, Your Radiance," Koss answered. "They may have been the strongest, and we told them they did not matter, and we laughed at them, and then we let them walk away." The intelligence was not contained for long, because the Valori were not the only ones who had been looking, and within weeks, every major intelligence service in the galaxy had assembled its own version of the truth, and the picture was the same everywhere. Panic spread through the capitals of the great powers like fire through dry grass. The Orthani Combine quietly and without announcement halted its expansion into the neutral systems, and pulled its fleets back to defensive positions. And High Commercer Zeleth stopped giving interviews and stopped appearing in public, and was seen by his aides spending long hours alone in his quarters, staring at tactical projections, with an expression that none of them had ever seen on his face before. The Kreth Dominion and the Silthari Republic froze their border deployments, and suddenly discovered a mutual interest in peace that had been notably absent just weeks before. Everyone was afraid, but what made the fear so paralyzing was that humanity was not threatening anyone. There were no human fleets massing on borders, no ultimatums, no demands, no broadcasts warning the galaxy to submit or face consequences. And that was what made it so terrifying, because a species that threatens you can be negotiated with, and a species that attacks you can be fought. But a species that simply turns its back and walks away, and builds something better without you, cannot be bargained with, because they do not want anything you have. Humanity had moved on, and they had not invited anyone to come with them. On the floor of the Galactic Council, during what should have been a routine session on agricultural trade policy, the truth finally settled over the chamber, like a storm cloud. A cold fog. And for the first time in the 12,000-year recorded history of the institution, the session fell into complete silence. No one spoke, and no one moved, and the silence stretched on, because no one knew what to say when the species you had mocked as vermin turned out to be giants who had been kneeling so as not to frighten you. High Commercer Zeleth was found later that evening in his private quarters, still staring at fleet projections on his display, and his aide approached cautiously and asked if the High Commercer was feeling all right. Zeleth did not look up. "We laughed at them," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "We laughed at the only species in this galaxy that ever genuinely tried to help us, and now they have stopped trying." His aide stood in the doorway and did not know what to say because there was nothing to say. Somewhere out in the dark between the stars, humanity was building something new, and the light from whatever it was had not yet reached the rest of the galaxy. But everyone could feel it coming, the way you can feel a storm building on the horizon. And every species in the Council knew with terrible certainty that when that light finally arrived, it would illuminate just how small they had chosen to be. 2 years after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, Director Kale Marin stood before a podium on a station that the galaxy did not yet know existed, and prepared to change the shape of civilization forever. The station was called Haven, and it orbited a quiet yellow star in a system that humans had named Compass Point. And it had been built in secret over the previous 18 months by human engineers working alongside species that the Galactic Council had either forgotten or never cared to notice. Haven was beautiful in a way that the Grand Convocation Hall on Thesara Prime had never been. Because while the hall had been designed to impress and intimidate, Haven had been designed to welcome, and the difference was visible in every curve of its architecture, and every warm light that lined its corridors. On this day, the station was full, and the beings who filled it were not the powerful and the ancient, but the small and the overlooked, and the ones who had been told for centuries that they did not matter enough to have a voice. Director Marin looked out at them and smiled, and then he spoke. 2 years ago, humanity left the Galactic Council because we were told that compassion was weakness, and that caring about the vulnerable was a flaw, he said. And we could have responded with anger, and we could have responded with our fleets, because we have fleets that would make any power in this galaxy tremble. But we chose a different path, because we believe that the measure of a civilization is not how much power it holds, but how it treats those who have none. And he paused, and gestured to the assembled delegates. Today we announce the founding of the Terran Compact, and I want to be very clear about what this is and what it is not, he continued. This is not a human empire with a friendly name, and this is not a tool for human dominance, and this is not a weapon aimed at the Galactic Council, because this is a partnership of equals. Every species with one voice and one vote, regardless of age or size or military power, built on the simple idea that we are stronger when we lift each other up than when we push each other down. The founding members of the Compact were announced one by one, and with each name the galaxy's understanding of what was happening grew deeper and more astonishing. The Dravani were first, the very species whose destruction had triggered humanity's departure, and they stood proud and strong in their delegation box. No longer a dying people on a dying world, but a civilization reborn under human mentorship, developing faster-than-light capability decades ahead of what anyone had thought possible, because human scientists had shared their knowledge freely and without conditions. The Galar were next, the crystalline beings the Council had classified as non-sentient formations for centuries, and their representative pulsed with patterns of light that the human translation team interpreted for the assembly, a speech of such beauty and depth that several delegates wept, and the Galar said that for 1,000 years they had been screaming into the void, and humanity was the first species that had bothered to listen. The Morith swarm sent a delegation of 12 linked individuals who moved as one fluid organism, and their speaker explained, through the chemical-to-audio translation system that the humans had built for them, that the Morith had spent centuries in quarantine being treated as monsters, and that when the first human linguistic team had arrived and actually tried to communicate, the swarm had been so shocked that a long moment passed before they could respond, because they had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to be treated as people. 11 other species joined them, each with their own story of being ignored or exploited or dismissed by the Council, and each with their own account of how humanity had found them, and offered not conquest, but friendship. The galactic media broadcast the founding ceremony across every channel, and the reaction was immediate and divided. The Remnant Council dismissed the Compact as a collection of primitives and misfits gathered around a species that was throwing a tantrum. And High Commercer Zeleth gave what would be his last public statement on the matter, calling it a zoo with pretensions. But the numbers told a different story. Within 6 months, the Terran Compact's combined economy had surpassed 12 mid-tier council members, because human technology, shared freely among compact species, created a rising tide that lifted every world. and compact research institutions, staffed by scientists from a dozen different species, were producing innovations at a rate that made the Council's best universities look stagnant. Within a year, the Compact's quality of life metrics were higher than all but the top 5 Council civilizations, and within 18 months they exceeded even those, because it turned out that when you treat people as partners instead of subjects, they tend to work harder and dream bigger and build faster than anyone expects. The defections began slowly. First it was the small species, the ones who had always been marginalized within the Council and had nothing to lose, and they crossed over quietly and were welcomed without conditions and immediately began to thrive in ways they never had before. Then the mid-tier powers started to look at their own stagnating economies and crumbling infrastructure and compare them to the flourishing compact worlds, and the comparison was not flattering. The real earthquake came when the Relani Federation, one of the 12 founding members of the original Galactic Council, a species so old that they remembered the Council's creation, formally requested membership in the Terran Compact. Their ambassador's public statement was broadcast across the galaxy, and it contained a single sentence that cut deeper than any weapon. "We joined the Council for protection," she said, "and we joined the Compact for purpose." The Council, now bleeding members at an accelerating rate, did something desperate. An emergency session was called, and in a chamber that was now visibly emptier than it had been 2 years before, the remaining members voted to impose sanctions on the Terran Compact. A full trade embargo, combined with travel bans and technology restrictions, designed to strangle the new alliance before it could grow any stronger. The vote passed with the support of the old powers, the Veilori and the Orthani and the Kreth, species that still believed that power was something you held over others, rather than something you built with them. Director Marin's response came within hours, broadcast on an open channel that anyone in the galaxy could receive. He stood in a simple room on Haven Station, wearing no uniform and carrying no symbols of rank, and he spoke directly to the camera with the calm, steady voice that the galaxy was beginning to recognize as the sound of humanity at its most dangerous. "You have sanctioned us for the crime of building what you refused to build," he said. "You have punished us for offering friendship to species you discarded, and you have declared economic war on an alliance whose only offense is proving that the galaxy can work better than you allowed it to." He paused and seemed to look through the camera directly at every being in every world who was watching. Every species watching this broadcast. Every world that has ever been told it was too small, or too strange, or too young to matter. Our doors are open, and they always were. And that is the difference between us and the ones who would rather sanction hope than admit they were wrong. Applications to join the Terran Compact tripled overnight, and the sanctions that were meant to isolate the Compact instead isolated the Council, because it turned out that when you try to build a wall around something people want, all you do is show them how afraid you are. Ambassador Alara Voss, now serving as the Compact's first Secretary General, was in her office on Haven Station reviewing the flood of membership applications when her communications officer informed her that an encrypted message had arrived on a channel that should not have existed. A private frequency known only to the highest levels of galactic power. The message was from the Veilori Emperor himself, and it contained a single sentence: "How do we come home?" Ilara stared at those 4 words for a long time, and she thought about the vote, and the laughter, and the word vermin, and the 214 years of accumulated contempt. And she thought about the Dravani who had almost died, and the Gelar who had screamed into silence, and the Morith who had forgotten what kindness. Then she typed her response. "You start by remembering that it was never your home to gatekeep." She sent the message, and turned back to her work, because there were 47 new species requesting membership, and each one deserved the same welcome that every forgotten civilization had received from humanity. The same open hand, the same warm light, the same simple promise that had changed the galaxy. You matter, and you are not alone. 5 years after humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, the galaxy had become something that no one would have recognized. And the transformation had happened not through war or conquest, but through the quiet, unstoppable power of an idea that refused to die. The Galactic Council, once a body of 489 species that had governed the known galaxy for over 12,000 years, had dwindled to 96 members, mostly old empires too proud to admit they had been wrong, and a handful of small species too afraid of change to take the leap. It was a hollow shell, a grand name attached to an empty hull, and everyone knew it, even if the remaining members refused to say it out loud. The Terran Compact now encompassed 312 species, and was growing every month, and it had become the dominant force in the galaxy, not through the threat of its hidden fleets or the power of its advanced weapons, but through something far more dangerous to the old order, the simple proof that cooperation worked better than domination. Compact worlds were thriving, their economies growing, and their people flourishing, and the scientific output of the Alliance had surpassed anything the galaxy had ever produced, because it turned out that when you bring together the crystalline computing of the Gellar, and the swarm engineering of the Morith, and the harmonic physics of the Dravani, and the stubborn creativity of humanity, you get innovations that no single species could have imagined alone. And then the Voidborn arrived. The warning came from a deep space monitoring station on the galactic rim, a compact outpost staffed by a mixed crew of humans and Dravani who detected the approaching fleet 3 days before it crossed into known space. And when the sensor data was analyzed, the results were so alarming that the station commander transmitted an immediate priority alert to every compact world and every council world simultaneously, because this was not a threat that respected political boundaries. The Voidborn were an extragalactic force, a fleet of massive world-eating vessels that emerged from the dark between galaxies with a single apparent purpose: to consume everything in their path, and their ships were enormous beyond comprehension, each one the size of a small moon, black and featureless, and radiating an energy signature that made sensors scream. But the truly shocking revelation came not from the Compact's analysis of the Voidborn fleet, but from the classified files that a group of Vylori intelligence officers leaked to the Compact in a desperate act of conscience. The Galactic Council had known about the Voidborn for centuries. Deep space probes had detected their approach over 800 years ago, and the Council's senior members, the Vylori and the Orthani and the Kreth and a handful of others, had made a deliberate decision to suppress the information, to hide the coming threat from the rest of the galaxy, because the knowledge of an approaching apocalypse was a tool of control, a way to keep the lesser species dependent and afraid and obedient. They had known, and they had said nothing, and now the thing they had been hiding from was here. The Remnant Council's combined fleets were insufficient to face the Voidborn, and everyone knew it, and so the Council did the only thing it could do. It sent a plea to the Terran Compact for help. The message arrived at Haven Station during a routine session of the Compact Assembly, and Secretary General Ilara Voss read it aloud to the gathered delegates, and when she finished, the chamber erupted into the most heated debate the Compact had ever seen. The Morith representative spoke first, and the chemical-to-audio translation carried the swarm's words in a voice that trembled with old pain. They quarantined us for 600 years and called us monsters. They ask us to save them, and I say, let them face what is coming alone, the way they left us alone. The Gellar pulsed with fierce, angry light, and their translated words were sharp. They classified us as rocks and ignored our screams for 1,000 years, and now they want our computing power to save their worlds, and I say they do not deserve it. The Dravani delegate stood, and her voice was thick with emotion. They voted to let my species die, and every one of them laughed when we begged for help, and now they beg us, and there is a justice in that which I am not sure I want to deny." Species after species rose to speak, and the weight of centuries of cruelty and neglect poured out across the chamber. And every word was justified, because every grievance was real, and every wound was deep. It was Alara Voss who spoke last. She was old now, her hair white, and her face lined with the years of carrying a burden that most people could not imagine. She stood slowly at the central podium, where she had once stood as a young ambassador, filing a withdrawal that changed history. "I know what they did to us," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber, and to every world connected to the broadcast. I was there, and I carried every insult, and every dismissal, and every slammed door. And I remember the laughter when we tried to save the Dravani, and I remember the word vermin, and I have not forgotten any of it. She paused, and looked across the assembly at the faces and forms of 300 species who had come together because humanity had believed they deserved better. "But we did not leave the council because we stopped caring about the galaxy," she said. "We left because we cared too much to watch it rot from the inside. And if we turn our backs now, if we let billions die because their leaders failed them, then we become exactly what they always accused us of being." Straightened her back, despite the ache in her bones. "Small," she said, "and we are not small, and we have never been small, and I will not let the cruelty of the powerful turn us into something less than what we are." The vote was called, and it was close, closer than any vote in compact history, but when the tally was complete, the result was clear. The Terran Compact would ride to the defense of its former tormentors. The compact fleet that assembled at the Galactic Rim was the most powerful armada the galaxy had ever seen, and it was beautiful, not because of its size or its weapons, but because of what it represented. 312 species flying together in formations that should have been impossible, each one contributing its unique genius to a force that was greater than the sum of its parts. Human stealth drives rendered the fleet invisible as it approached, and Dravani shield harmonics created defensive barriers of unprecedented strength. And Gelhar crystalline computing coordinated the movements of 10,000 ships with a precision that no individual mind could have achieved. And Morith swarm tactics turned the fleet into a single living organism that could adapt and respond faster than any traditional navy. The Battle of the Galactic Threshold lasted 11 hours. The Voidborn were ancient and powerful, and they had consumed civilizations across a dozen galaxies, but they had never encountered anything like the Terran Compact, a force that fought not with the cold efficiency of a single species, but with the combined fury and brilliance and determination of hundreds of species who had found each other in the dark and decided that the universe was worth protecting. When the last Voidborn vessel was broken and the debris began its long, slow drift into the void, the galaxy fell silent for the second time in 5 years. But this silence was different from the first. This silence was awe. Aftermath. The remnant Galactic Council formally dissolved itself in a ceremony that was quiet and somber, and attended by fewer than 100 delegates, in a hall that had once held hundreds. And the remaining members petitioned to join the Terran Compact not as rulers and not as senior partners, but as equals, the same status held by the smallest and youngest species in the Alliance. High Commercer Zelith, aged and diminished, and stripped of the arrogance that had once defined him, approached Alara Voss at the signing ceremony, and he moved slowly because his years weighed heavy on him, and because the walk from his seat to where she stood felt like the longest journey of his life. He bowed before her, and the assembled delegates fell silent, because no Orthani had ever bowed to another species in the entire recorded history of their civilization. "I called you vermin once," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. Alara looked at him, and in her eyes, There was no hatred, and no triumph, and no desire for revenge. Only the deep, tired compassion of someone who had spent her entire life fighting for a galaxy that had rarely fought for her. "I remember," she said. "I was wrong," Zeleth said, "about everything." "I know," Alara replied, and she extended her hand, that ancient human gesture of peace and welcome and trust, and Zeleth looked at it for a long moment before reaching out with his own massive gray hand and taking it. "Welcome home," she said. The compact assembly met for the first time as a unified galactic body 1 month later, every known species represented together and equal, in a chamber built by 100 civilizations working side by side, on a new station that orbited a star humanity had named Second Chance. Director Kale Marin, now elderly and long retired from public life, watched the proceedings from the observation gallery with a blanket over his knees and a cup of tea in his hands. Sat Thomas Chen, who had been a young aide on the day Alara Voss walked out of the Grand Convocation Hall, and who was now an old man himself. A young alien journalist, a Dravani with bright, curious eyes, approached Marin with a recording device and asked if she could ask him one question. "Of course," Marin said. "How did humanity do it?" she asked. "How did your species change the galaxy?" Marin smiled the way old men smile when they are asked a question whose answer is both very simple and very hard. "We did not change it," he said. "We just refused to accept that it could not be better. And it turns out that sort of thing is contagious." The journalist thanked him and left, and Marin turned back to the viewport, where the light of Second Chance streamed in golden and warm, and below in the chamber 312 species were arguing and debating and disagreeing the way free people do when they are building something together. Looked at his old friend and saw that there were tears on his cheeks. "Are you all right, sir?" Thomas asked. Marin wiped his eyes and laughed softly. "I am better than all right," he said. "I am home." And outside the viewport, the stars burned on as they always had, indifferent to the small, warm lives that moved between them. But for the first time in the long history of the galaxy, those lives were moving together, and the universe, vast and ancient and cold, trembled at the sight of it. Not with fear, but with something that might, if you listened very carefully, have sounded like hope.